Welcome to the Language Alchemy Podcast, and thank you for joining me today. This is your host, Alejandra Siroka, a transformative communication teacher and coach who's devoted to helping multicultural individuals and couples engaged in personal growth transform their lives and relationships through conscious communication. Thank you so much for being here with me today, because today I have a very special treat for you. As you may know, in the month of June in the United States, we celebrate Pride and we honor the LGBTQ members of our precious human family. I'm very proud to work with LGBTQ folks and help them find their authentic expression. And today, I want to welcome two dear clients who identify as LGBTQ, Shannon and Britt. Shannon and I started working together many years ago. Maybe Shannon will tell us when that was, when Shannon came to one of my communication workshops that I used to teach in my house in San Francisco. And then we worked a lot on communication with her business and many other aspects of communication. Then Shannon met Britt and sent Brit my way. Both of them have been on the Language Alchemy podcast before. Brit has shared his beautiful story in episode number 73, titled Coming Out, A Journey of Bravery and Skillful Preparation, where Brit shared with us what it was like to transition as a trans man. And Shannon was a guest at the Language Alchemy podcast in episode number 74. Shannon is a specialist who works with animals, and Shannon talked to us about how to communicate well with animals. So, Britt, Shannon, Britt, welcome once again to the Language Alchemy podcast.
Well, and it's 2013, by the way, was when you and I started working together. 11 years ago.
You would know. 11 years ago. Wow. 2013. And you have both become language alchemists. And I know a lot about you, but people don't. So I'd love for you to share your story. How you met, what life was like when you met for both of you, and how long ago that was.
It was 2017. The year. Sounds like we were both looking for dating online. So we met on a dating site, and Shannon was the one who reached out and sent a message to me, and it was very thorough and it caught my attention.
My profile, you mean? Or the message I sent you?
The message you sent me.
Maybe both.
I recognized the profile because I'd actually seen it several years before when I've been on the dating site, but I hadn't had the courage to kind of feel out that potential. At the time, I was very monogamous, and Shannon was identifying as polyamorous, and I wasn't sure exactly how a relationship with those two identities would work, or where I was at the time. So when Shannon reached out many years later, I'd already seen the profile and had an interest. So I kept reading, and after many, many emails back and forth, getting to know each other, we finally went on our first date.
Mm-hmm. And I had not, the dating website that we met on, like, you answer a bunch of questions and then you get to see what the other person answers. But I was so enthusiastic seeing his profile that I didn't bother to read any of the questions. So even though I had sworn off dating monogamous people ever again, I had not seen the question about, like, would you ever date somebody? Would you ever have an open relationship? And mine, of course, said yes, and his said no. And so I realized this after I kind of already had an emotional bond with him and was excited to meet him. And so I wrote to him and I was like, hey, we might have a problem here. And I was like, like, let's talk it out. Like, what are your feelings about this? And he told me a story about how he had once dated a polyamorous person, and I interpreted that story, and I guess this is a great communication story, right? Or a miscommunication story, because I thought he was telling me that, like, it was fine, you know? And then just months ago, actually, we're talking about this again. And he says, no, I was trying to tell you that it was not fine, that I didn't think that worked very well. And it might be a problem. But I was already so enamored with him that I didn't want to not meet him. And so I think I just saw what I wanted to see in that message. And I'm glad that I did, because I fell in love pretty quickly with him. And probably about within 6 months after we started dating, I decided to be monogamous with him. Though I still identify as a polyamorous person, I just am in a monogamous lifelong relationship. And, we went on our first date. We went up to Mount Davidson, and I'm a big bird watcher. And I like to say that I kept him because he brought me owls on our first date. I saw great horned owls for the first time ever, and I've never seen them since on Mount Davidson on our first date together.
I remember those days, Shannon, when you were so smitten by this captivating person named Brit that you were going on dates with and having all these conversations with. And it was so beautiful, to watch and witness. And Brit, how did you decide to then, okay, I'm going to go on a date with this person, even though this person is identifying as polyamorous and you are not, or were not and are not? What helped you say, I'm going to give this a chance and be flexible?
I think it was just the enthusiasm in that initial message. Like I think it would be a mistake to not feel this out and give it a shot. There was a lot of
chemistry.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And when you started dating, how would you describe your identities? Even like when you were filling out the form in this dating site, what did you say other than monogamous and polyamorous?
Initially, I identified as lesbian and I guess gay for that respect. So I was female, looking for female partners.
I identified and continue to identify as pansexual or bisexual, non-binary person who was assigned a female at birth. Though at the time we met, I think I wasn't necessarily as vocal about being non-binary as I am now. Though that was definitely something that we talked about early on, is both of us feeling non-binary and not fitting into our gender assignments. So that was something that we had in common from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And that probably, I'm not sure, but I'm guessing that site, with whatever options they offered, were perhaps limiting.
Actually, it was a website that was had a lot of options. By the time we met, it hadn't always been that way, but by the time we met, they had definitely added a bunch of identifying options and things like that. So it was definitely not as stuck in binaries of any type, and you could look for, you could look for masculine type people and feminine type people at the same time, rather than just one or the other. And also there was a lot of, I don't know what the site is like now because I haven't been on it in 7 years, but there was a lot of space to write about yourself, right? And so even if the boxes for the algorithm of who you'd be shown to were narrower, you could expand on that, right? So I remember on my profile, it was just anyone but cis men is who I'm looking for. And so anybody else, I'm game, let's talk.
And can you share for people who may not know what cis men mean? We have listeners in 48 countries all over the world, and they may not know. Also, a lot of people are English language learners, or English is their second language. So what does cis men mean?
Yeah, so cis men would be people who identify as men who were identified male at birth. And then another term that I used earlier also was pansexual, And pansexual, well, it's kind of complicated, and I use bisexual and pansexual interchangeably. The technical definition of bisexual is attracted to your same gender and at least one other gender that is not your gender. As a non-binary person, it's kind of like my gender is so expansive, like I'm not sure that that's like fully encompassing. And then there's also these terms pansexual and omnisexual. And pansexual is generally seen as, sorry, there's a cat sneezing behind us. Pansexual is generally seen as you're attracted to all genders and gender doesn't really factor into your attraction. And then there's omnisexual, which is attracted to all genders and gender still plays a part. I think technically it'd be more omnisexual, but very few people would actually know what I was talking about if I identified myself as omnisexual because it's such a niche label.
Thank you for that, because I'm sure a lot of people are, like relaxing now, listening to all these terms and saying, oh, thank you. Now I know what this means. I may have heard this before, but I wasn't really sure. And I'm really happy to see that as we are constantly evolving as a society and a human family, our language is evolving. Our language is becoming more open, more flexible. And in this dating site that you were talking about, how 7 years ago there were some terms, now you don't know if those terms are there, because also it sounds like they are also evolving and understanding that language plays such an important role in how we identify ourselves and how language can be limiting, it can evolve, and it can be expansive and inclusive. And so that was your identities when you started dating. How about now? Well, we've heard about you, Shannon. How about you, Brit? What is your identity now?
Now I identify as a trans man. And I'm not completely sure if that's considered completely straight to account for Shannon's non-binary.
Well, say what you told my mom recently.
I guess it was something along the lines of straight but a little gay. Kind of straight because I transitioned to a man, but still a little gay because Shannon's non-binary to account for all the ways in which Shannon identifies.
And then you said we just like the term queer.
We just like the term queer because it kind of doesn't have a box to... just one box to put you in.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Now, 7 years that you have been together, a lot has changed in your relationship. What are some of the main changes you had, the main transitions that you had?
My gender transition, for one.
We went through a global pandemic together. That was a big one. I also have been on a recovery journey from a cannabis addiction as well as an internet and technology addiction. And Brit has been super supportive of me through all of that. We also...
brief break.
Yeah, we separated for about 6 months. And then we also came back together. And then more recently, we got engaged.
That's right. You got engaged. Has it been a year already?
Almost. It'll be a month from Wednesday. So we're at 11 months. Fiance is our preferred term these days, which I didn't expect to embrace the fiance term, but we both like it a lot.
As I'm saying fiance until there's a more specific non-gender term that Shannon likes.
Yeah, we're not sure what to call me after we get married.
Spouse, maybe?
I just don't like that word, though. Yeah. And partner is always good. Partner is how we've identified with each other a lot. And I often still say partner. And I think a lot of people assume that when you say partner that you're not married, though. And I don't know how important that is to me to be recognized as married or not once we are married. We're still feeling it out. We haven't figured that out yet. But I feel good about in the future calling Brit my husband.
It's interesting that you don't like the term spouse, because in the etymology of the term spouse, and especially if we look at it in other languages like Spanish, it is the equivalent, the same word for handcuffs. Spouse. And
there's a certain romance to that, Alejandra.
I guess so. Yeah, for some people it could be like, that spices things up. But at the same time, particularly personally, I find my union with my beloved to be something very, very freeing. So not, I don't feel
Constrictive.
handcuffed at all.
Yeah.
Yes, and constrictive. Yes. So as you have gone through your different transitions and your different changes through your committed relationship of these 7 years, what are some of the important conversations you needed to have about the transitions you were going through?
Well, as I mentioned, like the topic of gender was like part of the conversation of our relationship from the beginning. And even though Brit's a trans man and I'm not, we both fall under the transgender umbrella, and both of us are, when we met, we're gender nonconforming, right? And so we didn't fit into that box that society put out for us. And I would say that in some ways, well, in lots of ways, I'm a bit more confident and outgoing than Brit. And I come from a family where I didn't even have to come out to my family because my family is so warm and loving and accepting that just wasn't a conversation that ever needed to be had. And that has always given me a certain level of safety that I could then go explore and be more expansive in my gender and sexuality. And when Brit and I got together, I think the way I communicated about gender with him created safety so that he could start thinking, maybe this thing that I've been thinking about for a while is something that I can actually like allow myself to think about as a reality instead of thinking of it as a fantasy. From the beginning, like I always encouraged him to explore in the safety of our relationship. And then as he became more confident, help him feel more safety beyond our relationship as well.
Yeah. And I see you nodding, Brit.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you add to that, or what would you say about your experience about some of these important topics that you needed to talk about with one another, or the support that you received from Shannon to feel safe to turn what you knew was your true identity not into a fantasy, but actually a reality?
I guess for me, my experience is just feeling just like super lucky that I ended up with Shannon, to have that support, to be in the position, because it wasn't just Shannon supporting me. Like I had Shannon's family behind me, and that kind of helped me have like something to stand on when I needed to come out to my family, which was a little bit different to different backgrounds. So that, yeah, super lucky for me.
Yeah. And how did you prepare to come out to your family?
I worked a lot with you. Many conversations with you and Shannon just focused around me needing to learn how to set boundaries and how to be open and stay open and not just assume how things are going to come out, and kind of set the stage and prepare for making sure that it worked out as best it could.
Yeah. And I think that I did a lot of reminding you that your family had changed a lot too, and, his family's always been so loving and warm with me. And I could tell that they love him dearly,
Yes.
And so I always believed that once he came out to them, that they would accept him and love him the way I had always seen them accepting and loving him. And, so I was there to remind him, like, I see this connection, and I think it's going to be okay, And so I think that just repeatedly reminding him of that eventually got him to the place where he felt ready. And again, in addition to all the wonderful work that he did with you, which was indispensable.
And the outcome was really beautiful.
Yeah.
Would you be willing to share, Brit, if you feel comfortable, a conversation you had with your dad about shaving?
Talking about shaving, and for the first time, and because I was like, I didn't grow up shaving, so this is all new. And my dad was like, I didn't grow a beard until after I got out of the military. He didn't have like the initial facial hair because he shaved so much because he was in the military. He didn't grow a beard, and he grew hair till after he got out of the military. So he didn't know what his facial hair looked like in the teen year.
And you even got to the point with both of your parents to be able to talk about these things with freedom and great confidence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And definitely getting those first few conversations helped when I was going through my top surgery and having to explain these more in-depth changes that we're going to be going on through my transition.
My dad makes a particular effort to be gender affirming with Brit whenever he sees them, especially since my dad and I had a conversation in private about that, where my dad, and I think it's worth noting that my dad is a 77-year-old cisgendered heterosexual man from Texas. And he, has always been very supportive. But at one point we had a conversation about language, and I just, we basically had like a tutorial, right? Where it was like, use this language, not this language, and think about how you would treat, all of my previous boyfriends, right? Because I have exclusively been in long-term relationships with people who were assigned male at birth and presented very masculine, and prior to Brit. And so it was like, how would you be with all of my previous boyfriends? Like, that's how you should be with Brit. And something clicked. And since then it's really beautiful. It's not corny or anything. Like, he's quite smooth about it. Like, he just seamlessly, always says something that's gender affirming, like every time he sees Brit, and it warms my heart every time. And then of course, my mom is always so open and loving as well. And I think I just recently I found out that Brit and my mom had like made plans to hang out together without me, and I didn't even know about it, which I think is just also warms my heart that my fiance and my mom are just like friends.
They care deeply about each other, don't you, Brit? Yeah. You're bringing something up, Shannon, that is so important, that when we are using language that is affirming, I think one of the most skillful ways to help others use affirming language is to say, it is like what it has been. It is like the language that's already familiar to you. And now you can include, you can open, you have more openness, and kind of like expand your aperture to include people who you have not included using this particular language. Because so many times as our language is shifting and evolving and our identities are shifting and evolving, we tend to think, oh, I can't use this language with this person. I can't use this language with that person, because now there is this transition, or actually they're claiming their true identity, something that they have known within that has been true, feels true, experiences as true, and that is true. But other people didn't know. So sometimes people, when they're learning new language, they think about the limiting aspect of it. Mm-hmm. Use this pronoun, but not that pronoun, instead of reminding that this language, when we affirm other people's identities, is just opening up language that we already have and including others within that language, and making that comparison that it is not so unknown. It is actually something that you already know. So yeah, I think that's useful.
And I think to that point, a lot of what you talk about, Alejandra, right, is like conscious communication, right? As opposed to habitual communication. What we're asking for is for people to just be more conscious in their communication, and to wake up and kind of shake off those old habits. And it doesn't have to be something that's scary or that like you get punished for if you make a mistake. It could be something that's exciting. Like, what a great opportunity to become conscious about our communication habits and the way we would like to communicate. It's not easy. I still struggle with it all the time, even as a non-binary person, and that we can change our conceptual framework, like you're talking about, where instead of thinking about it as like, oh, this is restrictive because this is what I can't say anymore, it's actually an opportunity to expand our consciousness around our communication, thinking about all the ways in which we use binary gendered language and getting creative and thinking, oh, wait, there's a whole bunch of non-gendered words I could use instead, and the creation of new language, right? English is a living language and we're creating new words all the time. I was just at my niece's 6th grade promotion and they were saying some word that now their generation is using I've never heard of, right? And so in addition to one of their student speakers actually coming out as non-binary to all of the parents and families there, which touched me deeply as a non-binary person, and I thanked them afterwards. And so, this is a testament to the expansive nature of the language that we speak.
Yeah. And as we evolve, our language needs to evolve. Mm-hmm. As we expand, our language needs to expand. As we become more conscious, our language needs to follow suit. As we mature, our language needs to mature with us as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, for you, Brit, having transitioned and now just being fully you, a trans man, how has your communication shifted? Have you noticed any differences in the way you communicate, in the way you communicate about you, the way you communicate to others?
Within my close peers, terrible amount of change, but I have noticed interacting with people outside and people that don't know me, that I guess you could say I've gone from not being noticed to being perceived differently when I interact with people. So
for better and for worse.
Yes, for better, for worse. So I get noticed more in general. And then also I have another layer of social perception that I'm not necessarily used to. So I've become more aware how I present in public to kind of offset that. Because at least my friends are have some history. And so it's just kind of me for them, but for other people, right, it definitely comes off differently.
And how is it for you to go from not being noticed to being perceived in particular ways?
In some ways it's nice. And in some ways, I guess it can be scary a little bit now.
Toxic masculinity is a thing. And toxic masculinity reacts to men and masculine type people in different ways than it reacts to women and feminine type people. There is a certain way that particularly men can respond more aggressively. We've seen how Brit has had to adjust his responses to that kind of chest puffing up, if you will, because men see him as a man, and, their willingness to escalate into violence is sometimes just simmering beneath the surface. And so the type of behavior that Brit may have engaged in and not have been taken seriously before is now seen as an affront to their masculinity that they now have to counter with the toxic masculinity.
That's such a good point. And for you, Brit, when you encounter that different kind of visibility with toxic masculinity, with males or even, non-males being more aggressive with you, what happens for you?
Unfortunately, it just happened a couple of times, but it's definitely been a wake-up call to be more aware of how I'm reacting. I'm trying to stay more engaged when I'm super tired and pay attention to what's going on as opposed to just kind of being reactive. So I have to kind of watch myself more.
Yeah. I love hearing from you that instead of being reactive, what you're doing is noticing and being more aware that this is a possibility, and then you get to choose how you want to respond to the specific situation.
Noticing when I get more of like an adrenaline reaction and like being like, why am I reacting in this way in this particular situation? Just being like, okay, nothing to go here. Just take a breath. Everything's okay. And then kind of deal with that.
Have you experienced as a non-binary couple ways in which you had to communicate very specifically or differently with strangers?
Well, San Francisco proper, like being in the city itself, feels pretty safe. But, you don't have to travel very far before we have to start thinking about our safety. Now, that said, we look like a cisgendered heterosexual couple, right? So most cisgendered heterosexual people or cishet people perceive us as cishet. And so there's a certain level of protection that we are afforded in that maybe we weren't afforded before when we looked like a lesbian couple. So there's this concept of being stealth when you've transitioned, and that means not kind of like flagging to the public that you are trans and passing as cisgendered.
I actually heard some stealth is even cutting off anybody who knew you before you transition. So there's no connection.
Right.
Who you were before.
Yeah. So there's a spectrum of stealthness, you might call it. And so, but even if you are able to pass, right? So there's this concept of passing for people who aren't familiar, which, historically was used in terms of racial passing, right? So for people who could pass as white, if they were, light-skinned enough or, blonde-haired enough or blue-eyed enough. And so in the queer community, there was this concept of, are you straight passing? And from the transgender angle, it's like, are you cisgendered passing, right? So when people meet you, do they immediately think, oh, that's a trans person? Or do they not think about it, right? Because if they identify you as a cisgender person, they're just not thinking about it. And there is a safety when someone can pass. However, there's always the risk of what's being called clocked. And so being clocked as trans by people who are transphobic. And so there are certain places that we don't feel comfortable traveling to. And we have also, this was something we did before Brit transition, because Brit was very masculine presenting even before. So like he went to a wedding in Alabama, and I reached out to the local queer and trans community in Birmingham. And I was like, is my partner going to be safe there? And so, but now with the increasing levels of transphobic legislation and just the increasing levels of kind of like unhinged vigilantism against trans people in certain states, like there are entire states that we just don't feel comfortable traveling to anymore, which is, for me, I've never felt unsafe traveling. And I still, if I were by myself, I might still go to these places, but like I wouldn't plan a trip for Brit and me to go to these places.
Yeah. Wow. And how loving of you to talk about these things in advance. Many times what I share with my clients, and I'm pretty sure I share this with you, the importance of preparation. And anticipating conversations, issues, topics, and looking at what are our intentions and what reality is like, and how are we going to communicate if this were to happen, not necessarily out of fear, but more out of capacity and being able to know, there are these possibilities, these situations that may happen. And so how do we want to show up? How do we want to communicate? What kind of experience do we want to have? And so by calling ahead of time is such a loving thing and helps you prepare to, okay, can I have a good experience? Can I go there? Am I going to be safe? And if not, what kind of support is available for me?
And sometimes we're pleasantly surprised. Like we just took a trip to New England. We had this amazing road trip in New England. My beloved cousins live in New Hampshire. And so we planned a trip around seeing them. And we didn't know what New Hampshire was going to be like. You know, it tends to be a Republican state. They're live free or die, but does that include living trans free or die? You know, I mean, it's just like we didn't know what to expect. And we were very pleasantly surprised that it was an incredibly welcoming state. We were not necessarily clocked by the cis het people, but we were clocked by the other gender nonconforming people who recognized us immediately as part of their family. And that was a really wonderful experience.
Do you have a community of people that you can talk to who can share your experience, where it's not just the two of you talking about what it's like to be a non-binary couple in this current world, traveling, going to other states, talking to family, and talking about your experiences?
Well, I have been trying to get Brit to expand his community in this way specifically for a long time. And you've made great progress, my love. And, you know, I have primarily sought out people through social media. There's lots of support groups on social media, specifically for spouses of people who are transitioning, because there's not a lot. There's a more visible transgender community, but there's not necessarily a lot of visibility for spouses of people who are transitioning. Now, some of those spouses are trans themselves, right? It's a different experience when you're on the spouse side of things. And then also there are some really wonderful communities and groups just sharing notes and information. I think it's been harder to find a strong local community, though we do like to go. Our local Dharma collective has a queer sangha once a month that we like to go to. Initially, I was dragging Brit to go with me, and now he goes without me. And we try to go to queer events and things like that.
Yes, what I wanted to say was shout out to the SF Dharma collective.
Yeah.
Yes.
They're a really wonderful community.
All right. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would like people to know, especially non-binary couples or couples who are feeling we need to have important conversations about our identity?
Well, I will say that, you know, kind of continuing on what I was saying as being like the spouse of the person transitioning, you know, that wasn't just about me showing up for Brit, but it was also about Brit showing up for me and what I was going through in that. Even though, like, I have supported him throughout this, that doesn't mean that there weren't challenges for me as well, and things that I had to reconcile for myself as part of that process. And Brit has always been extremely willing to listen to what I'm going through, and also has very skillfully recognized that, like, my being honest about my experience isn't like, okay, you need to stop this now, you know? And so he's been able to be like, I hear you and I love you. And also know that, like, he has to keep going to realize his true self, you know? And a huge part of that, and also just like the success of our relationship has been Brit's motivation to really meet me in terms of the communication work in our partnership. He once said to me, you know, I want to learn more about this and get more skillful in this because I see how much you do. And that inspired him to go see you, to do all the work that he's done with you and the work that he's done privately. And that also continued when we were separated. You know, each of us like focused on working on ourselves, and that allowed us to come back together and now have like an even fuller, richer, more connected relationship than we ever had before. And so, for me, just like Brit's ability to hold space for what's really going on for me, has been a huge part of the success of our relationship.
Thank you for bringing up the importance of listening. As we are having experiences, if we want to have intimate relationships, deep, rich relationships like the one that you have cultivated and are maintaining and growing into and deepening with each other, is our ability to listen. Sometimes things are going to be difficult. Sometimes things are not going to be like we had expected them that they were going to be. Sometimes we have to make room to hear about the experience the other person is having, even when we don't like it, because that's what creates safety and shared power.
I was just going to say that was exactly what I was going to say. The making of the space, like, for everybody to hear, and not just like talking over or having your own opinions of what the other person's experience is. You have to actually hear.
I'm just so proud of you and so happy for you. And I see you growing more and more in love. And it's so inspiring to me.
I think that's a really great way of putting it. Growing more and more in love. It feels like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you both. Thank you for your time. And primarily, thank you for really wanting to be your authentic selves and to doing the work necessary to be who you truly are. Because who you truly are is a real gift to our world. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.